Welcome to the Explainer. Okay, imagine you're suddenly in charge of ruling a huge ancient civilization. What do? Do you try to understand it from the inside out, or do you try to remake it to look more like home? Well, that was the heart of a debate that didn't just shape colonial policy, it actually shaped modern India itself.
As the British East India Company got more and more powerful, this was the big question they had to answer. How do you actually govern a place as old and as complex as India? Do you bring in your own system, lock, stock, and barrel? Or do you try to work with the one that's already been there for centuries?
All right, so here's how we're going to break this down. First, we'll tackle that core problem the British were facing. Then we'll get to know the two sides of the argument, the Orientalists and the Anglicists. After that, we're going to peek behind the curtain at the practical reasons for their ideas. And finally, we'll see just how long a shadow this debate still casts today. Okay, let's set the scene. We're in the late 18th century, and the British aren't just traders anymore. Nope, they're the new bosses. But that put them at a real crossroads. Were they going to respect India's ancient traditions, or just replace them with their own? And this one question really split the British thinkers right down the middle, creating two rival camps. On one side, you had the Orientalists. They looked at India's past and saw something glorious. On the other side were the Anglicists, who were convinced that the only way forward was through Western ideas. So let's start with that first group, the Orientalists. Who exactly were these guys, and what did their vision for India really look like? These weren't your average administrators. We're talking about serious scholars, men like William Jones and H.T. Colebrook. They had this deep respect for ancient traditions and believed that Indian civilization had this incredible, glorious past that had just kind of faded over time. For them, the key was to rediscover that heritage. And their mission was, frankly, huge. They wanted to understand India on its own terms. This meant diving headfirst into ancient texts, learning really difficult languages like Sanskrit and Persian, and translating them. And the goal of all this? To use India's own ancient customs and laws as the very foundation for British rule. And this wasn't just talk either. They put their money where their mouth was. They built major institutions to actually preserve and promote Indian learning. You had the Calcutta Madrasa for Muslim law, founded in 1781, and then just a decade later, a Sanskrit college in Varanasi for Hindu philosophy. Just look at the sheer amount of work they did. They took on these massive translation projects. We're talking cornerstones of Indian thought like the Bhagavad Gita and digests of Hindu law. And again, this wasn't just for fun. This was a huge effort to make India's foundational legal and literary works understandable to the British officials who were now in charge. But as you can imagine, not everyone was on board with this approach. By the early 19th century, a new, powerful, and, let's be honest, very loud group showed up with a completely different idea: the Anglicists. People like James Mill and Thomas Macaulay basically launched an all-out attack on the Orientalists. Their argument? Promoting Indian learning was a total waste of time and public money. They claimed that all knowledge from the East was just riddled with errors and, well, unscientific thinking. Now, a key voice pushing this was James Mill. He was a Scottish historian and philosopher, and his ideas ended up having a huge impact on British policy in India. In his big book, A History of British India, Mill's view was, let's just say, not very charitable. He pretty much argued that all Asian societies were stuck on a lower rung of the civilizational ladder compared to Europe. To him, India before the British was just a dark age of superstition, and only European laws and ideas could drag it into the light. So, if James Mill gave them the theory, the guy who really put it into practice was, without a doubt, Thomas Macaulay. He was the first law member of the Governor General's Council, so he had real power. And Macaulay, well, he did not mince words. This quote right here says it all. He basically believed that Western knowledge was so superior that there wasn't even a contest. One shelf of European books, in his mind, outweighed everything India had ever produced. So he went to the government and argued, really passionately, that they needed to stop wasting money on what he saw as backward Oriental learning. The future, he said, was English. Teaching English would give Indians access to what he called the world's finest literature and, crucially, to all the latest breakthroughs in Western science and philosophy. So, you've got these two completely opposite points of view. But let's ask a question.
Were the Orientalists really just a bunch of romantics lost in old books? Well, when you look closer, you find a much more practical reason for what they were doing.
And here's the thing. The Orientalists' interest in Indian culture wasn't just for academic kicks. It was a calculated strategy. It was just plain practical. They knew that if you actually wanted to rule India effectively, your officials had better speak the local languages, get along with the local leaders, and understand the existing laws. It was about making colonial administration work. So after all that back and forth, this huge clash of ideas, who won? Which vision for India ended up on top? Well, in the end, there was a pretty clear winner. Macaulay's aggressive, confident arguments won the day. His Anglist vision became the blueprint for the modern Indian education system, a decision that would change absolutely everything. And the consequences were massive. A whole new education system based on European models was rolled out. English became the language of power, the language of government, of the courts, of getting ahead. At the same time, funding for traditional learning in Sanskrit and Persian basically dried up. And, most importantly, this created a brand new class of English-educated Indians, an elite group who, ironically, would later use those very English skills to challenge British rule itself. So why does any of this matter now? Because this isn't just some dusty old debate from a history book. The legacy of this clash between the Orientalists and the Anglicists still echoes through modern India today. It shapes everything from what's taught in schools to how people think about their own national identity. It's a powerful reminder that the answer to that simple question, how do you rule, can define a nation for centuries.